Welcome to theothergoddess channel with Dr. Joanna Kujawa, Joanna for you. And in this channel, we discuss the archetypes of theothergoddess, spirituality and sexuality, Mary Magdalene, and today we are also going to discuss Eve. So I'm very excited about it because in theothergoddess, I didn't even touch Eve because I knew that she's a completely separate heroine and I wanted to focus on Mary Magdalene, and that Eve deserves her own book. But fortunately, we have someone with us who wrote the book. So in a moment, I will introduce Dr. Celene Lillie to you. But I would just like to say that in one of the citations for my book, I used a quote from Roger Housden, who says, "I trust them because they have tasted the fruit." And they meant the fruit of the spirit, but I meant the fruit of knowledge, the forbidden fruit. And I always knew I wanted the fruit. And I think as we look into the what I would call real story of Eve, I think we are all know this feeling that when we read the biblical story, it just doesn't make sense about Eve. I mean, and when I was reading the story, I felt Eve is not bad. She is not the villain here. She was framed. Serpent actually seemed quite wise to me, because I'm a little bit of a rebel. So I thought like, yeah, go for it. I want that forbidden fruit. I want the fruit of knowledge. I, devoted my whole life to this, right? I want that fruit of knowledge. But as I was reading Celine's book, I realized that the forbidden fruit and spirit are actually one and the same thing in the story in a way. So the spirit of Eve, especially. So without much ado, I would like to introduce a very special guest, and I'm so thrilled, like honestly, totally thrilled to have Dr. Celene Lillie with us, who wrote a wonderful book, The Rape of Eve. So Celene, it's so good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Joanna. It's such an honor to be with you all today, tonight, this evening, this morning, whatever time it is, wherever you are.
Thank you so much. So Celene, before we go into your fantastic scholarship, because I don't want to undermine it, so it's a fantastic scholarship, because Celene, and I just am now nervous and I'm going to say something wrong. She actually the Rape of book is based on her analysis of 3 Gnostic works found in Nag Hammadi in 1945. For some of our listeners that may not be familiar with this, there are the discoveries from 1945 where also Gnostic Gospels were found, and I talk about them on our channel. So she will basically base her book on 3 Gnostic documents from Nag Hammadi on the origin of the world, the reality of the rulers, which is very interesting in our times, and the secret revelation of John. So the Rape of Eve, dearest friends. So Celene, before we go into your fantastic scholarship, I would like to ask you a more personal question about your spiritual journey. How have you even arrived at, the writing of this book? And I know that you wrote something else after that. So tell us something about your spiritual journey and how it led to the book and to Eve and, the forbidden truth and forbidden knowledge and the forbidden fruit.
So this is a winding story, and let me see if I can tell it as succinctly as possible. So I grew up in, I live in the United States. I grew up in a fairly progressive Christian household, although many of my extended family were fundamentalist evangelicals. So lots of different varieties of Christianity growing up. And when I was in high school, my family moved to North Carolina, and there was, so this is the Southern United States, definitely even more the Bible Belt then than it is now. And the Christianity that I encountered was vastly different than what I grew up with. And so I really left the church for quite a long time. I explored all kinds of indigenous traditions, goddess traditions. I ended up working at a women's book and gift store when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and just really was kind of doing really doing kind of the typical, maybe late teenage, early 20s spiritual seeker thing in the 90s. And I found myself, I had done a couple of years of school. It really wasn't what I didn't love what I was doing, and found myself in Boulder, Colorado. And while I was here, decided I wanted to go back to school and connected with Naropa University here, and finished up a degree in contemplative psychology there, and really thought that I was going to take to become a Buddhist and take refuge vows. And when I was in school, September 11th happened. And there was this unbelievable rhetoric around the axis of evil. I would get, I was going to say I'm going to get political here, but my work is kind of political, so we'll just hang out there for a little bit.
Go for it. Yeah.
But listening to President Bush's at the time speeches and feeling myself like triggered and activated, and realizing that he was quoting the Bible and wasn't talking about it, that there were old hymns that would show up in his speeches and he wasn't talking about it. And I just started asking these questions about, is this really what early Christianity says? Is this really what's going on? And at the same time, reading the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk who just passed away, Thich Nhat Hanh, who both kind of said, karmically, you've grown up and you were born into these Western traditions. What would happen? What you love about Buddhism is actually there. What might happen if you mined them for their gems? And there was something about this at this point in my life that just hit me really, really deeply. And so I decided to start applying to seminary so that I could learn something about what was happening in the Christian tradition, what it said. During this time period, I also worked at a large independent bookstore in Boulder, and would find myself pretending to shelve books in the Christianity section because I didn't want people to know that I was actually exploring Christianity. Yeah. And came across the Gospel of Thomas there, and the Gospel of Mary, and thought, you know what? If this is what part of early Christianity is about, maybe I can get on board with this. So I ended up at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. One of the funny coincidences around this is right before I was deciding where to go, I was reading a Tom Robbins novel, Villa Incognita. And in the story, one of the characters goes to Naropa and the other one goes to Union Theological Seminary. And I thought, this is totally great. This is where I'm supposed to be. And thought that I was really going to leave this interest in these extra canonical texts behind. And it turned out that my New Testament professor, Hal Tausig there, was very interested in Nag Hammadi and started teaching these texts in my Intro to New Testament class. And very quickly, I took a class, I guess my second year with him, called Loosening Canon, where we actually looked at canonical and extra canonical texts alongside one another to look at this range of literature that comes out of early Christianity. And I thought, this is it. If I can do this, if I can study this, this is what I want to do. And I had thought I was going to be a pastor and ended up applying to PhD programs. And really, I feel like, this is definitely one thread about finding, like you, I actually wrote my master's thesis on the Gospel of Mary. So I'm also a big Mary Magdalene fan. But figuring out these women that have been slandered throughout Christian history, and have really shaped the way that women view themselves. And I had so many questions about what was going on, who these women actually were, and were there other strains of thought in the earliest layers of these traditions. And when I started to find them, I just couldn't let go, and found it so liberating, both spiritually and historically. I would say both things, to be able to say, this is not just me having some spiritual wish fulfillment about this, but there was something real going on in the ancient world with these women that is also our birthright today. And so that's part of part of how I got involved with kind of looking at Eve.
Yay to this, because I actually didn't know that, what was the impulse behind it. I knew the story, but I didn't know the impulse behind it, because my impulse for the other goddess was exactly the same. Like it is this two intuitive feelings. One is more general, that the beginning of Christianity, even before I learned about Nag Hammadi and the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostics, there was something fundamentally wrong with the stories we are being told. Women on the side, just something is completely mistold. And the representation of women, which completely debilitates us, and I argue our relationships also, and debilitates men because they think they have either mother or a harlot, or, it just completely creates this kind of mad polarity in our psyche, with respect how women were viewed, so that's why I thought, like, I was furious about how, because I come from a very intense Catholic background, so we in a way have same but different but same, which I'm not Catholic anymore, but the same fury. So I actually felt the fury, and I think, and suspicion that the story was completely different. And I feel that, you had the same fury, and that it's not just something that happened in history, it is something that drags in our psyche in a very fundamental way. And it is not just a women's issue, it is like everybody's issue, because a part of consciousness has been hijacked, right, by sidetracking women who were actually contributed, but were portrayed in a unspeakable, either stupid Eve or sin a Mary Magdalene, or just in any way possible that could be diminished, right, and demeaned they were. And I just please.
Well, I was going to say, I just want to say, I love the fact that you bring up the ways in which, this isn't just about kind of subscribing what women can do, but it's really about the limitations on men too, that men have to be dominant. They need to act in certain ways. They need to be in control. And that what I found actually in the early Christian literature is that their role is almost more prescribed in that kind of violent patriarchal way than this range of women that we get between what's happening with Eve, all of which I'm like, why doesn't anyone preach a sermon on this? The end of Paul's letter to the Romans lists all of these women, including the apostle Junia. Like, why isn't anyone talking about this? But that the ways in that women are actually playing all of these roles. And when you get to kind of the little bit later literature, like First Timothy, and then particularly what's coming out of the early church fathers, men can only be one way, and then women can only be one way. And both of us everyone's put into these boxes. And what does it look like if we start to open boxes on one side, and what possibilities does that open on the other? And I love that you're talking about that, because I think it's so important.
And because I interviewed some interesting men too, and I just am also observant. Men are sick and tired of this part, and I always say, because just because I talk about these topics, I do not exclude men. Quite on the contrary, and I actually can tell you that most men, actually, at least half of my supporters, are men, and they say, "Go for it, Joanna," because they are sick of it, sick and tired of this. And I always say that I use patriarchy as a term in a very different way. It's not men against women, but that patriarchy as a systematic abuse of everybody, because the patriarchy also sent and forced men to war, right? Yeah. So it's not like they had it easier. They were also debilitated. Maybe it was a bit easier to be a man, but there's a price to pay for it, and from a spiritual point of view, we are all somehow, there's some effort to debilitate us. So I'm really deeply grateful for your book, the Rape of Eve. And if you want to just go a little bit deeper into this, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we all know the story, especially in the Western part of the world. And most people with modicum of insight, feel that there is something weird about the story. First of all, okay, even if you believe that Eve was, not very smart and serpent is bad, there's a very strange, supposedly God creator, who is really a very angry person, right? With completely ridiculous expectations and rules, right? And once you start to question this, like I'm like, who's that guy, right? When I was reading it, mind you, I am kind of rebel in you know in spirit. And then I thought, well, if he is unreliable, then maybe the rest of the stories are unreliable, such as the serpent was evil, and then the Eve was not at the very least naive, right? So please tell us about this three Gnostic sources that you looked into and how they, you know, speak about Eve and the whole story together with Adam and so on.
So I think one of the things that I just to talk about the Hebrew text really quickly that I find really interesting is that when you get into the Hebrew itself, the story acts very, very differently than how it's been traditioned to us as Christians. And it's one of, oh, and it's terrible that I can't remember his name right now. It's an article that I assigned in one of my classes. But there is a scholar who really thinks that when Eve started to get the worst rap is when she started to be read alongside Pandora. And as woman being created as a punishment against Prometheus giving human beings fire. And so that you get people like Tertullian, who's one of these early church fathers around, you know, right around 200. And, you know, he's talking about Eve being the devil's gateway and all of these, you know, all of these pieces that then start getting read into the text. And that if you go back to the Hebrew text, it's not quite there as much. But we start to get these things kind of traditioned in, even in the New Testament with like First Timothy, where, you know, women be silent, don't teach anyone. The only way that you will be saved is through childbearing, because that's what Eve basically did to you. And it seems that there were these other, I don't even know if I want to call them, are they Christians at this point? Who's writing these texts? I think this is still something that needs more research, but people who are using these stories, the Jesus stories, Greek and Roman mythology, to kind of reimagine what they think is going on with Eve, and clearly not agreeing with these patriarchal, and I'm going to use it in the way that you do, that it's a system, that not agreeing with these patriarchal systems and really looking at the violence that's going on against men and women in the world, and take this wonderful story from the Hebrew scriptures and recast it. So I think I did pull this up because sometimes I find it's more succinct if I do this. I have this little kind of composite of the three stories, and I might just read it a minute. So do a little bit of storytelling so that it's really clear and we get these pieces in, and then we can kind of think about this a little further together. And just to say, so again, this is a composite of these three stories, but everything that I'm saying is actually in one of these three texts. So none of this is made up. None of it comes from me. It's all in these kind of ancient texts. So I also do like to let people know there's some pretty gruesome sexual violence in the middle of this. So just to be mindful about, you know, what your capacity is as you're listening to this. So just so that people know what this is about. So the story begins kind of in the divine realm, and this divine realm existed in perfect perfection. It was a realm of mutuality, of concord, and a realm of harmony. And then something happened. A rupture occurred, and from this rupture, the world we know was born. In charge of this world was the chief ruler. And this ruler thought he was God. In fact, he declared to all of his minions, those in his government, so to speak, I am God and no other exists besides me. His words reverberated throughout the cosmos, and a voice came from the divine realm disrupting him, saying, "You are wrong, Samael," which is one of the chief ruler's names. The chief ruler and his minions were both shaken by and jealous of this voice, of this power they could not control, a power which both usurped and demoted them. They decided that they needed to entrap this power, to control it. So they decided to create a human to seduce it. And they created Adam. And they huffed and they puffed, but they could not enliven him. So Adam remained still on the ground. The divine realm saw the ruler's helpless Adam, and Wisdom Sophia decided to send down her daughter Life to help him, so that they together could overcome the rulers of the world. First, these divine women sent their breath to Adam, and with their breath, he was given a soul, but still he could not stand. So Life, also called Eve, seeing Adam on the ground, said to him, Adam, live, arise from the ground. And Eve's word became a work, and Adam rose and opened his eyes. When he saw Eve, he said to her, you will be called mother of the living, for you have given me life. The rulers saw Eve talking to Adam and became jealous of her power. They made a plan saying, let us grab her and rape her so she can no longer return to the divine realm. The children she bears will then be subject to us. But let's not tell Adam, for he isn't like us. Let's stupefy and teach him in his stupor that she came from his rib, so that the woman may be subject to him and he may be lord over her. But Eve in her divinity knew their plot and laughed at the rulers. Eve stupefied them, and she entered into and became the tree of knowledge, leaving her likeness like a shadow behind. Thinking this shadow was the true Eve, the rulers acted cruelly. They entered her and possessed her and raped her. They were wicked. They defiled her in abominable ways, and they defiled the seal of her voice, which had declared they were not gods. This was the beginning of marital intercourse. But the rulers erred. They did not understand they had defiled their own body. The rulers then placed Adam and Eve in paradise. The rulers told them that they could eat of any tree in the garden, but if they ate from the tree of knowledge, they would die. Then the wisest of creatures, the serpent, a creature of the divine realm, came to Eve and said, did they tell you not to eat from the tree of knowledge? Eve replied, he not only said, do not eat from it, but do not touch it or you will die. The serpent said to Eve, do not be afraid. In death, you all will not die, but when you eat, your minds will become sober and you will know the difference that exists between evil humans and good. He said this to you in jealousy so you wouldn't eat from it. Eve had confidence in these words, so she took some fruit from the tree, into which the divine Eve went and became. And she gave some fruit to Adam, and he ate it too. Their minds opened. When they ate, the light of knowledge enlightened them. When they became sober, they recognized each other and loved each other and knew that the rulers were like beasts and loathed them. And through their love and partnership, Eve birthed children who would become the saviors of humanity, delivering the people from the subjugation of the worldly rulers.
Wow, that's a fantastic story, isn't it? So thank you for putting it together, because, you know, reading it from 3 different Gnostic sources, and we know how encoded sometimes they can, you know, it would be difficult to get the whole narrative. So thank you so much for putting it together. So can you unwrap it now, go maybe in more stages, you know? So what is the tree of wisdom then? What is the tree of knowledge?
So, you know, I think this is a really interesting question. And I don't know if I have, I don't know totally what my answer is. And I think it changes day by day as I grow with the story. But one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that, you know, all of these figures, so Eve, the serpent, emanate from this figure of wisdom.
Yes.
And there's something here to me about this connection between knowledge needing wisdom. And part of it is about really about right relationship with one another. And I always actually think about Starhawk's work and her idea of power with instead of power over. But this really, you know, this piece where it is about really being able to see, here is also, and I'll maybe say more about this later, but, you know, I am still very infused in Buddhism. And so this idea of the interconnectedness of all life and being able to see that with clarity and understanding how our actions reverberate into the world. So I mean, I think there's so many possibilities that I really don't want to foreclose them. But there is this real piece about both having this clarity of vision, this wisdom, this understanding how the world works, and this piece, I think, of partnership that happens. Like, it's not done in a vacuum. It's done between the earth and this creature, the serpent, and Adam and Eve, and that somehow it's this amalgam that allows this knowledge to kind of come to fruition.
Thank you so much. And we couldn't be more on the same page, honestly, because when, you know, when I talk about in the other goddess, I said that this actually represents goddess consciousness. And by that, I mean the other form of wisdom, which is very intuitive, because you're imbued with Buddhism. I'm imbued with esoteric Hinduism, because this is where I moved when, you know, the story stopped making sense to me. And then I found Gnostic gospels and so on. But I'm actually acting from the perspective, so to speak, of esoteric Hinduism. And in this, but also in Buddhism, you know, you have, like in Zen Buddhism, you have Satoris. In esoteric Hinduism, you have the Buddhi, which is the higher mind. It is even in Christian, classic Christian theology from Thomas Aquinas, intellection, immediate grasp, you know, and I think this is of divine knowledge. So I think it is actually about divine consciousness and the fact that we do have access to it, we just don't have the methods, and somebody doesn't want us even to know the methods and tools to get there. And I just wonder, and again, I am more into a Hinduism, it is that serpent could represent, maybe, I hope it's not too wild for you, you know, Kundalini energy, which is, you know, the divine wisdom moving through us, you know, through our bodies. So that's why it's also earthly, because it's not somehow up there, right? But it's an energy that is actually part of who we are, right? So that's lots of tantric and other practices are about awakening this divine energy within us. So, and I just want to tell you that this is just amazing. So we are doing like comparative religions here, which is good. Or spiritualities. I prefer spiritualities because I'm kind of done with institutionalized religions. So I'm speaking only for you. I don't about me. I don't want to get you into any trouble. So there is this tantric work, Mahatmya Devi, which actually talks, and actually many esoteric tantric works, and not only tantric, but any form of esoteric Hinduism that has the similar story about Adam and Eve, except they call them Shiva and Shakti. So Shiva is basically a corpse until enlivened by Shakti, you know, by the feminine principle, right? So this is the same story. And I think I totally agree that this is about connection between knowledge, which is very technological, you know, rational mind, which is the animus of our mind, so to speak, in Jungian terms. And we completely suppressed, for whatever reasons, we'll point fingers maybe later, you know, but it's best to point finger at yourself, right? Because this is, it gives us, empowers us, right? Take responsibility. for this other form of knowledge, which is actually deeper intuitive wisdom, which has immediate access to, for the lack of better term, divine consciousness, right? Which is both transcendent and immanent, right? It's both also in us. And I think that now more than ever, we have to access this wisdom, right? Because I think we are doing okay with technology, but we, are going too much in this direction. And we really need technology without wisdom, without heart. It is dangerous, right? And this is where we are going. So this was, thank you. That was just so fantastic. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. So
No,
let's look at the similarities.
No, it's totally awesome. And, it's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately too, is that, so, in Tibetan Buddhism, we talk a lot about absolute wisdom and relative wisdom, and that really what it is it's the coming together of the two beyond dualisms. And I do think, as I listen to you talk, I do think that there's a huge piece in this text about, like, where are these connections? How do we experience these unions? And I think, one of the interesting things to me about Christianity, and I think, and I don't know a lot about it, but I think that Judaism has it more in Kabbalah, but Christianity somehow has missed out on these kind of technologies of the self, where there are paths that you can kind of go step by step through these processes. And I do wonder a lot if they are in texts like this. I think about, and this is a lot really based on the work of Karen King, who wrote a book on the secret revelation of John, or Apocryphon of John. And she talks about, there is this wild part where these lower gods are putting together Adam's body, and there are all of these names, and asking this question, are these names about healing? Like, is this about healing? And I always wonder, are there seed syllables in these names? Is there a resonance that's happening too in the body, which then could absolutely be associated with something like whatever their version of Kundalini energy is? I mean, almost every system has some kind of spinal, central channel in Tibetan Buddhism, thinking about Taoist bodies, but this, this central line where you want the energy and the chakras to be lined up together. And are there things in these texts that we have just lost the language really and knowledge about, that were operative in the ancient world?
And I completely agree with you, because, for example, in Catholicism, we just had prayers that we had to repeat, but they lost meaning because they're just mechanical prayers. So what I call it again in Hindu terminology, deshaktified, which means they do not carry energy because it's very mechanical. But for example, in Hindu mantras, which is not that different from Catholic rosary, for example, the energy is still there, simply because they have the seed words, as they called it, right? Which is from Tibetan Buddhism, I bet, that they still carry the wisdom. There are Sanskrit words, like in Hebrew they have, right, in Kabbalah also, you have to tell them in a particular way, and they carry, the energies, they carry the power. And somehow, I don't know, in Christianity, it was in the, should I say, canonical, institutionalized Christianity, it was either forgotten or, repressed on purpose, because later we can talk about the Roman Empire, and it was basically appropriated, right, for the sake of state religion, which it still continues to be, especially in the United States, may I say. So, so this is absolutely true. But what's his name? Tobias Churton in the Gnostic Mysteries of Sex, he talks about Gnostic groups that actually use something like, they talk about serpent energy in our bodies, that through sexual practices you can awaken, except that I believe he because I had a conversation with him, and other scholars believe that it was, just was crossed over from India through Persia to the Holy Land. But I have a theory. I wonder, what if you have a theory? It is that actually it is within our human consciousness. We know we have it. So different cultures could also develop it independently, so to speak. It's not only that everything came from India. Just because it is missing in Christianity, it is because it was suppressed, but it was there. Were Paratics and I think and Nasins who were using actually tantric, believed in Kundalini energy. They just called it a serpent and energy, which is one and the same thing.
Yeah, I think this is one of the ways in which, sorry, I'm pausing and I'm just going to say what I think about this, that I do think that this is one of the ways in which, like the anti-Semitism of Christianity has really come down to us today. And like, why don't we think that these could have been esoteric Jewish practices? I mean, we know that stuff was going on, like the ascetics at the Dead Sea. We know from someone like Philo, oh my goodness, the Therapeutae,
Yeah,
with the Therapeutae community. Yeah, so the Therapeutae in Egypt. And I'm like, why don't we think, why do we think that this can only come from one place? Yeah. And to me, so then this is, I'll put on my scholar hat for a minute, but like, it's this way. And then which I feel like we want it to be a particular kind of esoteric that's orientalizing, and that like, what would happen if we actually thought, wait a second, this can come from these traditions too? And how might that actually bring different kinds of life and different kinds of conversation to the table as we think about both the complexities of doing this type of cross-cultural work, and this piece which I think you're getting at too, is that I really believe is our human birthright to be able to experience this no matter where we are.
I completely agree. And I think it's a matter of human consciousness, and the inner knowledge rather than everything coming from India, right? Not to discard anything, because everything actually comes from India, but I started to see that these things are actually happening here and there in Western culture too, except that they were suppressed or repressed or forgotten, right? But I agree with you on this, that it was definitely there, because there were traditions within Western tradition that look into it, different hermeneutic traditions and so on. So, but I don't know why it was forgotten. But I wanted to go somewhere, now I forgot where, because I got too excited about the topic. But that's true, I do believe that it's not that I know where I wanted to go now. It is, I think, when we talk about the rape of Eve, what I believe also, when I was reading your book, that is also rape, and generally when I think about early Christianity, that it was the rape of Jesus's teachings, that it was the rape of early Christianity as well, right? Because it was like diminishing it in some way, putting it into a square box so it fits a particular institutionalized version of what religion or spiritual belief has to be. And then, to make it more available and more like imperial, so to speak, everything that was worth learning from this was lost. You know what I mean? Because then it becomes like, okay, I can imagine a TV show, like saying some holy being comes, he says, yeah, we know about it, but make it so it is available to everyone, so it's basically water it down as much as possible, and then any meaning is lost. And all we are left, and I'm being controversial here, and I'm not saying that Celene is saying it, I'm saying it just, for a protection, is that we are left with stories that make little sense to us. And all we have sometimes is the feeling that there's much more into the stories, except that we are not told, the whole story. We just have like, cartoon characters, when there are deep stories with deep meaning that was somewhere lost on the way.
I mean, I think that's such an important point, and that even the stories, there are some beautiful stories in the canonical New Testament, but that it's hard to access them at this point because of all of these overlays. And one of the things that I think I do want to say is, which I don't actually talk about this in the book. I was like, it was part of one of my thought experiments, but I work with a group of folks who doesn't use the word Gnosticism very often because of the way in which Christianity has really gotten bifurcated into like Orthodox and Gnosticism, or it becomes this kind of catchword for heresy. Yeah. And what I think is actually really interesting when we kind of get rid of both of these terms, orthodoxy, heresy, Gnosticism, whatever, proto-orthodoxy, I don't like either, because you already have a teleology there and you're headed someplace specific. But that people in the ancient world like had this flexibility and this creativity to take the Jesus story and run with it and make all kinds of different meanings. And it was really diverse. And it was really, I think I just want to use the word creative again, that, they looked at their spiritual lives, at the lives of the world, at what was happening in the world around them. In a lot of cases, in terms of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of it was not an easy place to be. And really use the Jesus story as this possibility of making meaning in a difficult world, and trying to find spaces to be with one another that were operative, I think, outside of these hierarchies. And what you see kind of as the texts move along, as we get to kind of later texts, is that these hierarchies really start to come back into play. And I think some of this is an infatuation with Roman power and the way that it's based on these patriarchal systems. And I also wonder at times if, because of some of the early persecutions, and we don't think they were as widespread as kind of initially scholars in the mid 20th century thought, but nevertheless, there was this threat of violence that's going on all the time. And so I do wonder too, if people thought, well, if it looks more like Roman, if Christianity is imbued with more Roman sensibilities, maybe they won't come after us as much. And these are the things that I think started to foreclose possibility instead of this flourishing that we see that's happening in the texts. And even now, and I think that this has been slightly egregious with Nag Hammadi, but also somewhat so with the canonical texts as well, is that the translations have been really esoteric, also to make sure that people can't understand a word of what's happening in the texts. And so then if you don't have specialized knowledge, you can't go to them. And I remember when I was doing my research, I was reading some of the early church fathers on kind of the heresies, and there would be portions of them that they left in Latin, and there would be like a translator's note that saying, this is too dangerous for lay people to read, so we're just going to leave it in Latin. But even with the English translations, we've managed to do this. And I just wonder all the time, like, what would happen if people had better translations, if we were working on this on a regular basis, so that more people, so that we could actually use our collective wisdom in new ways to imagine the possibilities of what are happening in these texts.
I absolutely agree. And can I just make two comments? One of them is that it brings my favorite man to mind, which is Jean-Yves Leloup, who translated my favorite version of the Gospel of Mary. And he says pretty much exactly the same. He says, why do we have to make this distinction? And between Gnostic and canonical, he says, why don't we read it in its entirety? So this is what Gospel of Mary says. This is what Gospel of Thomas says. This is what Gospel of John says. This is what Gospel of Matthew says. And, this is the beautiful richness, spiritual richness in all of them. But because, this distinction became, apparent simply because once it was told that this is the only good version, right? So then people started, okay, so there are other versions, and they probably just coined them as Gnostic, right? Whatever that means, because we know there are many Gnostic groups, so it's nothing like one Gnostic thing, right? But I completely agree with you and Jean-Yves Leloup, who says, like, this is a gift. That's a spiritual gift. All of these texts are spiritual gifts, drink from them, and refer to your own spiritual experience and learn from them, right? So this is it. And when I made this earlier provocative statement, it is actually came from the bottom of my heart, because for the reasons, because for first 30 years of my life or so, I tried to be a devout Catholic, but I couldn't make sense out of stories. You know what I mean? So then I thought, okay, I was hungry spiritually, so I started to look to places which actually gave me technologies of spirit, right? But I started to have spiritual experiences, and I could then, how to relate to them and so on, rather than what felt to me then, because I don't want to sound completely ungrateful, as dogma, because it's not like I was just rebellious. I became rebellious spiritually, let's to say, when I couldn't find answers. So it came actually from pain. The statement came from pain, because it's not like I was just rebellious. I just no, I have to find the answers, and if it means outside of this text, then it is. But now I'm slowly returning, through the esoteric Hinduism to early Christianity and so on. So that's my slightly circular path. But you are absolutely right. The wisdom is in all of the sources, and but we have to honor all of them. Because sometimes I don't remember whom I talked to recently or listened to someone, to some British, I think Anglican scholar, I forgot his name, on Ian by Gnostic Radio, and he said that sometimes people who get interested in Gnosticism, they get completely to the other side. Everything is evil here and everything is good there, when it is really about variety. What is it? It is so diverse, and so it should be, because spiritual experience is so diverse, right?
Yeah, and we get, just to say too, which is always the thing that I think about, and I need to go back and read this text sometimes, but there in Nag Hammadi, there's a text called the exegesis of the soul, and in Greek the word for soul is feminine, and it basically says like the soul is a whore because she's a woman. Like there's some uncomplimentary stuff there, and I think this is part of, again, knowledge infused with wisdom, is that we need to be discerning, and we need to look at all of this stuff and not make these really quick not make these kind of snap judgments about, oh, if it's in the canon, it's bad. Oh, if it's outside of the canon, it's good. But really, where are the places that we see possibilities for human flourishing? And where are the places that really seem to be dealing in violence? And I'm going to say death, but I want to be careful about that because of our allergy to death in the modern world. And life and death are two, but these things that kind of weaponize, that weaponized text, maybe is how I'll say that, instead, against people that serve to separate and divide. And we need to use our own discerning wisdom to look at these texts and see what's there, and not just make assumptions with anything about what's happening within them.
That's right. So read it with exactly this divine consciousness, connect to this, what it actually symbolizes, rather than, yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with this, but it requires, and again, I'm going back to what I learned from Hinduism, discernment, so in Hinduism, there is no sin, there is a lack of discernment. And I think this is what we really need when we look at the canonical Bible, is to discern, what is there, and you can, flourish spiritually from this too, right? It is just the discernment. So rather than, ignorance or taking something, as it is taught to you, right?
Or maybe in Christianity, we might say discernment rather than dogma.
Yeah, that's right. Discernment rather than dogma, especially from Christianity. I came, and perhaps even you, right, in a different edition of that. But I would like, before we part, I would like to also cover the topic of Adam, because there is a kind of positive ending to this, rather violent story about Eve being raped by the false rulers of the world, or people who are demons or archons, the false gods who call themselves gods. So what happened to Eve and Adam at the end?
So I think for me, this is actually one of the most beautiful parts of the story, is that not only does Eve eat the fruit, but she gives it to Adam. And there is this piece that somehow about, and if we think about contemporary trauma theory too, that what happens in trauma is that we split, and then the process of, how might reintegration happen, and that it can't happen, that reintegration can't happen alone. And here, part of it is with the snake, and part of it is with her partner, Adam. And that's actually, the text calls him a partner. And I absolutely love that. That here is, you want to talk about like what allyship might look like? Like, you know what, I'm going to eat your fruit too, so that I can see in the same different way that you see, and that the different ways that we see together are going to somehow allow us to do something different, that we need both of our perspectives. Both of us need to take this in, and somehow we need both of us to be able to see what's happening in partnership, so that we can move beyond these structures that have been imposed by the world around us. And as you can tell, I think it's so exciting to think about this way, rather than like, oh, y'all are going to be condemned to sin for the rest of your lives and all humanity afterwards. It's like, no, it's this possibility of what might it be if we join in union, and how might we see differently if we can actually take in each other's pain and suffering and joy and sight and wisdom and knowledge, all as like a package, and what might be possible out of that.
Yeah, and fly with it, and fly with it, right? And also, the bottom line also, we need both masculine and feminine. So when I talk about the feminine, I always repeat at the end nearly of every show that I'm not talking about the feminine because I think it is more important or it should replace the masculine, but we have to bring the feminine to the surface so it can join with the masculine, right? Because we cannot leave this other part of our psyche in complete darkness. And the same reason why I started to talk about sexuality, not because I want to be outrageous, but it has to be brought into light. We have to integrate it, and in a way that makes sense to us, right? Not in a way that it is portrayed on media, right? So this is what I mean. We have to bring up all of these things to surface and cherish them and treat them with discernment. Right? Like
Joanna, I just,
love.
As you're talking about this, one of the most interesting things about this text to me is that kind of some of the first generation, and I just always want to say I'm super grateful for these folks. If they hadn't done what they had done, this generation of interpreters, I never would have been able to see or do what I'm doing today. So I just want to acknowledge that before I kind of give my little critique of this. But they basically read these stories and was like, they're the same as the story in the Hebrew Bible. Eve is the one who brings sexual sin into the world. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, whoa, this is so not what's happening in this text. Mm-hmm. Like, it's talking about like real violence in the real world, but it's also talking about the sexual union of Adam and Eve as this beautiful piece of enlightenment through eating the fruit. And so there is, it's this kind of double entendre of knowledge. And what does it mean to know? As we use it in English too, to have, intimate knowledge of someone. And they used it that way in the ancient world too. And so to just think about what that means, and that it's such a different path from so often how sexuality and sin are just one and the same in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, and it's so boring, and and not true. So fantastic. So once again, I would just like to, as I said, that's why I put this quote from Roger Housden. I trust them because they have tasted the fruit. And I think it is just so pregnant with meaning. And again, we can interpret it any way we want. But for me, sexuality and also, the wisdom, the knowledge, and the union of the masculine and feminine and that this other part of consciousness that is feminine but exists in both man and man, as you know, in Jungian terms, as animus and anima, we have to bring it back together and, you know, and cherish all of us before we can move on spiritually. And I think we are here to experience life and spiritual evolution. Thank you so much, Celene. It was just such a total pleasure. I think it is my favorite interview of all my interviews, you know, and I don't want to, like, you know, discourage anyone, but it was fantastic. It was a huge joy for me. How can the viewers connect with you? Because of course they can find your book, The Rape of Eve, but you also teach different courses, no?
I do. I actually do teach some different courses. I teach those classes are sometimes hard to get to. One of the best places actually to find me is with the Westar Institute, which does historical Jesus work. But I can also, you know, I'm happy to give my email address to you that you can post, so that if people have questions or want to contact me directly, or I probably shouldn't say this, but, you know, or if they want to take a look at the book and it might be out of their price range, you know, I'm happy to help people out with PDFs maybe.
Thank you so much, because we were just speaking before the show that because Celene wrote a beautiful academic work, unfortunately, academic books are priced by the publishers who, you know, just want the universities to buy it for their libraries, and pretty much only universities, you know, can buy it for this price. So that's wonderful. But also, please, just right after the show, if you could send me the link to how the you know, the institute that you mentioned. I'm sorry, because I forgot the name of it, so I can put the link in the description. So once again, Celene, thank you so much. And the book we're talking about is The Rape of Eve. And until next time, thank you so much. Thank you, Celene.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you. Bye-bye.